Imagine that you open the bathroom door and find your stepson completely naked. A single image so vivid it began to invade my dreams, stirring desires I couldn't have anticipated. That's exactly what happened to me on what seemed like a perfectly ordinary Wednesday afternoon. I had just gotten home from work, the sound of my heels clicking against the wooden floor echoing through the quiet house. The day had been long and exhausting, and all I wanted was to slip into a hot bath and let the stress melt away. Little did I know that night would leave an indelible mark on my life, changing everything in our home. Make sure to subscribe to Cheater's Confessions so I can keep bringing you more captivating real stories like this one. And don't forget to watch until the end. This story is going to be incredibly intriguing. The house was silent when I walked in, which wasn't unusual. James, my husband, had mentioned earlier that he'd be attending a late-night meeting. He had been working long hours recently, trying to meet the deadline for a major project. That left only Caleb, James's son from his previous marriage, at home. Caleb was 20 years old, a reserved but polite young man who rarely caused any trouble. He worked part-time at the local hardware store and spent most of his free time in his room. Though we weren't particularly close, we had a cordial relationship based on mutual respect. I'd always seen him as someone who valued his space and privacy, much like his father. Over the years, I'd grown accustomed to the quietness of the house when it was just the two of us. As I placed my bag on the kitchen counter and poured myself a glass of water, I noticed Caleb's truck parked in the driveway. Strange, I thought. He usually worked the afternoon shift. I called his name casually, my voice echoing through the empty house. No response. Assuming he was in his room with his headphones on, or maybe napping, I didn't think much of it. After finishing my glass of water, I decided to head upstairs to change into something more comfortable. The long day had left me longing for nothing more than to relax. As I passed by the bathroom, I noticed the faint sound of running water and the door slightly ajar. That struck me as odd. Caleb was meticulous about his privacy. He always closed doors firmly, especially the bathroom. My curiosity was piqued, and I hesitated for a moment before gently pushing the door open just a little more. What I saw stopped me cold. Caleb was standing at the sink, his back to me, his shoulders hunched over as if he were deeply focused on something. His jeans hung loosely on his hips, and I could see that he was completely shirtless. But it was the reflection in the mirror that truly froze me. In his hands, he was holding himself, his movements clumsy and almost frantic. The creak of the door startled him. He turned around abruptly, his eyes wide with panic as he scrambled to cover himself with a towel in his hands. "Oh my God, I didn't hear you come in!" he exclaimed, his voice trembling, his face flushed with embarrassment. I felt a wave of discomfort wash over me like a tide, but my mind registered details I shouldn't have noticed. His body, his posture, and that image that seemed to sear itself into my memory against my will. I forced myself to look away, though the blush on my face betrayed just how much the scene had affected me. "I am so sorry," I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to interrupt." I took a step back toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. My hand reached for the doorknob, ready to leave and give him the privacy he so clearly needed, but his voice stopped me. "Wait," he said, his tone pleading, disarming me completely. "It's not what you think." I hesitated, my hand hovering over the knob. Part of me wanted to run down the hallway and pretend this had never happened, but another part was caught by the vulnerability in his voice. Against my better judgment, I turned back to him, keeping my eyes fixed on his face. His expression was a whirlwind of emotions, embarrassment, confusion, and something else I couldn't quite decipher. "Okay," I said cautiously, trying to keep my tone neutral, as I closed the door a bit more to give us some privacy. "What's going on?" Caleb hesitated, then finally began to speak. At first, his words were vague, stumbling as he tried to describe the discomfort he'd been feeling. I listened patiently, trying to piece together what he was attempting to say. It quickly became clear that this was a sensitive topic, one he was far too embarrassed to discuss with his father. As he spoke, I couldn't help but feel a pang of empathy. It's never easy to ask for help, especially about something so personal. I could see the struggle in his eyes, the internal battle between wanting guidance and fearing judgment. "It's okay," I said after taking a moment to reflect. "First of all, it's good that you are paying attention to these things. It shows you care about your health. Second, here is no shame in asking questions or seeking advice." Caleb looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and relief. "Really? You don't think it's weird?" "Not at all," I assured him. "Everyone has questions about their body at some point. It's normal." I spent the next few minutes offering him advice as best I could. Drawing from my knowledge and experience, I tried to keep the conversation practical and objective, steering clear of anything that might make him feel more uncomfortable. I could tell this conversation was a huge relief for him, even if it had been hard for him to start. As the conversation went on, the initial awkwardness began to fade. Caleb seemed to relax, and I could see that he appreciated having someone to talk to. By the time we were finished, he looked visibly calmer. He even managed a small smile. "Thank you," he said softly, almost whispering. "I didn't think I could talk to anyone about this." I returned his smile, feeling relieved that the tension had passed. "You're welcome, Caleb. And remember, it's always okay to ask for help. No one has all the answers." When I left the bathroom, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of emotions. On one hand, I was glad I could be there for Caleb when he needed someone to talk to. On the other hand, the situation had been so unexpected, so out of the ordinary, that I wasn't sure how to process it. Every time I closed my eyes, the image came back to me, as if my mind were playing a cruel joke. But what disturbed me most was the nature of those thoughts. Somewhere deep inside me, buried under layers of guilt and shame, I found myself recalling details I shouldn't have noticed. The outline of his body, the fragile confidence in his gaze, and the way my own skin had warmed at the sight of him. I tried to drown out those thoughts, but they always found a way to resurface, more insistent and more troubling. There were moments when I caught myself longing for something that had never crossed my mind before. The idea of feeling him close, of surrendering to an impulse so wild and forbidden, scared me as much as it intrigued me. "What's happening to me?" I whispered into the solitude of my bedroom, unable to recognize myself in these fantasies that seemed to belong to someone else. There was something about that encounter that felt significant, as if it marked a shift in our relationship. Only I didn't know what it meant, or how the coming days would unfold. I tried to shake off that strange feeling as I went about my evening, but it lingered at the back of my mind like a shadow. The house was quiet, the only sound the gentle hum of the air conditioning. James came home late that night, tired but cheerful, completely oblivious to the peculiar conversation that had taken place in his absence. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop replaying the events of the evening in my mind. Something had shifted, though I couldn't quite pinpoint what. All I knew was that life in our house would never feel the same again. The days that followed that unexpected encounter were peculiar, to say the least. It wasn't that anything overtly dramatic happened. On the surface, everything seemed normal. James continued with his work as usual. Caleb stuck to his routine of part-time shifts and studying, and I carried on balancing my responsibilities at home and work. But beneath the surface, there was an unspoken tension, subtle yet palpable, between Caleb and me. It wasn't just that we were now more aware of each other's vulnerabilities. It was something deeper. A shift in the dynamic had occurred, one I wasn't sure how to navigate. Caleb had always been a mystery to me, keeping most of his life to himself. Our conversations, though cordial, had never gone beyond superficial pleasantries. But now, after the conversation in the bathroom, I felt a new level of understanding between us, one that was both uncomfortable and strangely comforting. I found myself thinking about him more than I should, not in a maternal way, not even out of concern, but with a sense of wonder. How had I not seen this side of him before? I realized Caleb was more than just the quiet young man who stayed in his room. There was depth to him, an emotional world I hadn't even begun to understand. It was on a Friday night when the change in Caleb's behavior became more noticeable. James had gone out to meet a client, and I was preparing dinner. Caleb hadn't yet returned from his shift at the hardware store. I was chopping vegetables when I heard the familiar sound of his truck pulling into the driveway. I froze, the knife suspended midair, wondering how I should greet him. The awkwardness that had settled between us in recent days had created a wall I didn't know how to break down. When the front door opened, I called out, "Hi, Caleb," trying to sound casual. He didn't respond immediately, but I heard his footsteps as he walked into the kitchen. He looked tired, but gave me a faint smile. "Hey," he said softly. "What's for dinner?" I returned his smile, relieved that he wasn't acting as distant as he had in recent days. "Just some pasta." "Are you hungry?" "Yeah, I am starving," he replied, moving to the counter to pour himself a glass of water. We ate together in silence at first, the only sound being the clinking of forks against plates. I tried to focus on my food, but it was impossible to ignore how Caleb seemed more at ease than he had been in days. Every so often he would glance up at me, our eyes meeting for a brief moment before he quickly looked away. There was something in his expression I couldn't quite place, a mix of gratitude and something else I didn't dare to interpret. After a while, he put down his fork and looked directly at me, a faint blush coloring his cheeks. "I've been thinking about what you said the other night," he began, his voice soft, hesitating for a moment before continuing. "And I just wanted to thank you again for listening." I looked up from my plate, meeting his gaze. There was a sincerity in his eyes that left me momentarily frozen. "Of course, Caleb," I replied with a smile. "I am glad I could help." "You've always been kind to me," he said quietly, his tone almost a whisper. "I didn't want you to think I don't appreciate it." His words were simple, but there was something in his voice that made the air around us feel heavier. I nodded, unsure how to respond, and realized my fingers were nervously playing with the edge of the tablecloth. "I know it's not always easy," I murmured, trying to fill the silence. "But you can always count on me." Caleb smiled faintly, but instead of looking away, he held my gaze, and the atmosphere in the kitchen seemed to shift, growing more intimate. I felt a pang of nervousness and leaned back slightly, as if I needed more space to breathe, but he didn't move. "Thanks for dinner," he said finally, but his voice carried a note I couldn't ignore. When he stood up from the table, I thought the moment had ended, but instead of leaving, he walked around the table and stopped beside me. I could feel his presence, the warmth radiating from him, so close that I froze in place. "Are you okay?" he asked, his tone filled with genuine concern, but his gaze was more intense, almost as if he were searching for an answer I didn't know how to give. "Yes, I am fine," I replied quickly, though my voice was softer than I intended. Before I could react, Caleb lifted a hand and gently brushed a strand of hair from my face. His touch was brief, almost imperceptible, but it left a mark I couldn't ignore. Time seemed to stop for a moment, the space between us shrinking to almost nothing. My breathing quickened, and though I knew I should say something or move away, my body refused to respond. Caleb tilted his head slightly, and for an instant, I thought he was going to lean in closer, but something stopped him. I watched as his eyes searched mine, as if he were trying to read my thoughts. "I shouldn't," he murmured suddenly, breaking the silence. He stepped back, putting distance between us, but his gaze remained fixed on mine. "I am sorry. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." "No, it's fine," I said quickly, my voice trembling slightly. "It's okay." But I wasn't sure who I was trying to convince him or myself. Caleb nodded and, without saying another word, left the kitchen. I stayed there, sitting with my heart pounding and a whirlwind of emotions I didn't know how to process. Everything had been on the verge of changing, but somehow we had stopped just short of crossing the line. And while part of me felt relieved, another couldn't help but wonder what might have happened if we hadn't. Later that night, after finishing dinner, I sat on the couch to relax with a book, but I couldn't focus. The words blurred before my eyes as my mind kept returning to the moment at the table. There was something in the way Caleb had looked at me, something that made me feel vulnerable in a way I couldn't explain. I heard his footsteps in the hallway, soft but deliberate, and before I could come up with an excuse to avoid any conversation, I saw him appear in the doorway. He was wearing a gray t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair slightly messy, as if he had spent too much time debating whether or not to come. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low and weighted with something I couldn't quite identify. "Yes, of course," I replied with a nervous smile. I closed the book and set it aside, trying to appear calm. "Do you need something?" Caleb didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked slowly toward the couch and sat at the opposite end, leaving a safe distance between us. Yet somehow, the space seemed to shrink with every passing second. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted finally, rubbing his hands against his knees. "I feel like there are things I haven't said, and I didn't want you to think badly of me." "Caleb, I would never think badly of you," I assured him, though my voice was softer than I intended. "You can talk to me about anything." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes searching mine. "Sometimes I feel like I don't know how to handle what I am thinking, what I am feeling. And since the other day, I haven't been able to stop thinking about you. About how you make me feel safe." But also, his words trailed off, but the intensity in his gaze finished the thought. A shiver ran down my spine, and although I knew I should stop this conversation before it went too far, something kept me rooted in place. My breathing quickened, and the silence surrounding us seemed charged with electricity. Caleb lifted a hand, hesitating before brushing his fingers lightly against my cheek. It was such a gentle, unexpected gesture that I found myself closing my eyes for a moment. "This isn't right," I whispered, but my words lacked conviction. My body remained still, caught between the desire to pull away and the curiosity to see what would happen if I didn't. "I know," he murmured, his voice barely audible. But he didn't move, and neither did I. We stayed there, trapped in a moment that felt like it lasted an eternity. I could feel his breath on my skin, the warmth radiating from his body so close to mine. Finally, it was he who broke the tension, pulling away slowly. "I am sorry," he said, his face flushed as he stood up from the couch. "I shouldn't have bothered you. Good night." I sat there, unable to move as I watched him disappear down the hallway. My heart pounded, and my mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. There was something undeniable between us, something neither of us seemed able to ignore. But as I sat alone in the living room, I wondered how long we could keep walking this fine line before everything changed forever. And that's how a seemingly ordinary night turned into something I will never forget. A moment that changed our dynamic forever and left more questions than answers. What would have happened if things had gone further? Where will this tension, which neither of us seems able to ignore, lead us? If you want to hear more fascinating stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe to Cheater's Confessions and hit the notification bell so you don't miss a single confession. If you've made it this far into the video, comment the words "Open Kitchen" so I can dedicate a special shout out just for you. See you in the next video, darling.